Welcome along, everyone. I'm Colin. I'm a trainer with Software Education or the Skills Development Group. And here is Brian, who is a fellow trainer. He deals mostly in the space of product ownership, project management, facilitation skills, and such like. Now, about 25 years ago, Brian, my boss asked a group of us he was just wondering, where do you go to get the latest happenings and techniques and so forth in the project management space? One of my friends immediately piped up, the museum. Now, that was, like I said, 25 years ago. Agile, we didn't even have the Agile manifesto in those days. So now here you're going to be talking about Agile project management and flexibility and such like. It's almost an oxymoron, isn't it? Flexibility and project management.
Yeah, pretty much.
But
Could
this is
be.
the challenge for you, I guess. Prove my friend wrong. Show me what's happening now in this space. And yeah, take it on. All yours, bud.
Awesome. Thank you, Colin. Kia ora, Colin. And tēnā koutou katoa, nau mai haere mai whakarongo mai. Welcome everybody to our session today in this webinar. It's good to have you all here. And I'm also looking at the list that's on here. I see some familiar names. So welcome to those that I've met previously and welcome to those I haven't met, whether online or in the classroom. It's good to have you and good to meet you here. So let me just share my screen and we'll kick this off. Like so. All right. So welcome to our webinar today. And hopefully I get to prove Colin's friend wrong. Let's see. That's a nice call out. So Agile project management, navigating the future with flexibility and efficiency. And this is what we're going to talk about over the next little while. So it'd be interesting to hear also your thoughts, questions that you might have as we navigate through this particular webinar, particularly around project management and how it sits in the current landscape. We're also going to look at some things that might help us as project or in delivery space to help become more nimbler or more effective, more efficient, perhaps, as project managers. So let's do our thing. It's good to start right at the beginning. So what's a project? Well, I figured let's go to the dictionary. What does a project mean? So a piece of planned work or an activity is finished over a period of time and intended to achieve a particular purpose. Cool. I think we're well aware of that, right? A piece of planned work. We do an activity. We have a period of time. It's set in stone. And this is generally when we think about a project, we're thinking about this is the time frame we're working in. This is the team that we've got. And for that period of time, this is what we're focused on. So it's very dedicated to a particular purpose. However, projects tend to focus on the things that are measurable. So time, cost, scope, those sort of things that we can measure, not necessarily what's valuable. So how many times have we heard this project has come under budget or under time, or this project is running over time or over scope, or it's actually over scope. Yeah, perhaps the unicorn project, something that's over scope, under budget, under time, perhaps not going to happen. But is it valuable? Are we focusing on the right things, right? Are we talking about outcome? And those things there are particularly useful for us as a project manager working in the project management space or a delivery space, because what we're starting to see now is this almost blurring between project management and value management, and they're tending to come or blur the lines around this. And I'll talk more about this in a few moments. Well, in terms of projects, you see a massive shift, and a lot of you may have already been in this space. You see a shift more towards product centric, all about the product, the emphasis on the product owner thinking about value and now and articulating the vision of the product and thinking about how do we achieve an outcome for the particular delivery squads, teams, whatever you want to call them, to enable them to be effective around the outcome. There's a massive push around that, and it makes a lot of sense. But there's a particular skill set that is missing a little bit from that product ownership space, and that skill set is around delivery. So how do we manage delivery? One of the skills that project managers tend to have well is how we actually manage and orchestrate delivery. Right. So there is this thing, and I'm seeing this push again in a lot of different organizations where we say or talk about a product owner, but the product owner is also responsible for delivery. But they not necessarily have that particular skill set that a project manager might have. So when we think about the differences between the two, we're really about the output. The project team is about an output. It's very temporary. I think we understand that, right? Whereas that product team is a long-lived team that is looking after the value stream of that particular product, or looking after the value life cycle of a particular product or products, right, if you will. But how do we deliver, or how do we manage within that? There's no reason why we couldn't also run projects within a product life cycle, right? So they're not mutually exclusive of each other. But again, going back to those skill sets, how do we as project managers navigate this new agile world? Because this agile world, which we'll talk about in a few moments, right, is really centered around the product owner. Now, whether that's a good thing or not is almost a secondary point. The key point is what we're focusing on. And that key point is about how do we deliver to an outcome. And the skill sets that we have as project managers can be quite effective in that space because it helps us be able to connect back or align to that particular outcome. So let's have a look at this a little bit more. And I want to still stay at the beginning, which is this. And that beginning goes back to the Agile Manifesto. Now, some of us in this room will be familiar with the Agile Manifesto and some not so much, right? Depending on, and this is what Colin was talking about 23 years ago when his friend said, hey, we find new things in the museum with regards to project management. Well, fantastic, right? But the manifesto, this is your basis for everything Agile. It's not Scrum. It's not XP. It's not DSDM. It's not Crystal. It's not Amplio. It's not TameFlow. It's not SAFe. It's not those frameworks necessarily. The frameworks themselves are vehicles to unlock agility. This that you see on screen is agility. So cool. So people interaction, their processes and tools, customer collab over contract negotiation, working software, or the way I like to describe it, working solutions over comprehensive documentation, responding to change over following a plan. Right? So if you think about those four values, right, what we're attempting to do is a degree of nimbleness or a degree of agility. We're not either left or right of this. We don't need to be fully to the left, people interactions, customer collaboration, working solution, responding to change, to be agile. Right? So this is when I often refer to agile as being context driven. What's the context in which we work in? How do we adapt to that context? How do we become a little bit more nimbler? So the difference between working effectively, agile, combined with the ability to work efficiently, lean, pulling those things together, those frameworks that I mentioned before help us unlock this, right? So give us a little bit of structure or a framework, scaffolding, if you will, around that. Now, I guess some of the key things here, when we think about our context, is how do we as project managers apply the skills that we have to the appropriate context now that we've overlaid an agility lens across it. And one of those things is about how do we respond or adapt to change, right? As opposed to following a premeditated plan, right? Or here's a plan, it's not going to vary. The plan is the plan, let's follow the plan. Good idea. However, things happen. We live in a world that is very complex. We'll explore this in a few moments. So how then do we respond to change is often the question. So what we're talking about here is information, it's data, it's feedback. It allows us then to see what is happening around us, align that to the plan, align that to the outcome. Then how do we adapt our delivery accordingly? And of course, one of the key things I've seen, good project managers tend to be the people or the or the people that tend to be able to relate to people well, right? And be able to galvanize a team to deliver X. And this is where it can be really cool, particularly if you're working in quite closely with a product owner, right? And a scrum master and lead or an agile lead or whatever you might want to call them, right? Working with that kind of tactical leadership. How do we do that, right? Cool. So that's the Agile Manifesto. It's been around it probably came out just after the museum comment, which will forever be stamped in our memories. The museum comment. Colin, hopefully you get to timestamp that one because I'm going to see if we can drop that into further discussion. But along with the Agile Manifesto, and as the manifesto came through, and the Rebel Alliance, as I like to call it, the pushback against, say, big bloated projects that were big upfront designs and big upfront deliveries and all the things that go with it, and the agility or the agile push was a push back against it. Alongside this came this, and this was about 2005, and Alistair Coburn drove this, who was one of the original signatories to the Agile Manifesto. And this is about the project managers' interdependence. So how do we pull together a community? So at the time, when the manifesto was built, projects were still a real thing. We hadn't moved entirely to this product mentality. Even though Scrum was talking about product owners, XP had some sort of conduit to the customer, a customer rep, if you will. It wasn't quite there in terms of that product mentality, which we have now. So what we had at the time was still project managers. They were still a viable role, still a viable skill set. So if you look through these things, right, increasing return on investment, so ROI, but a continuous flow of value is the key thing. That's our focus, right? So again, it crosses quite closely over to product ownership, delivering reliable results by engaging customers, which goes back to our Agile Manifesto, manage and expect uncertainty, which is respond to change as opposed to following a plan. The key part there, I think, here is this: unleash creativity and innovation, which is very product centric. Right? So you think about product, you think about design, that's very much in that space, but it's also about people. So again, good project managers tend to be the ones that are able to unlock the creativity and innovation of our people, right? Boost performance through accountability and improve effectiveness. Good things, right? These are all good things. And to be able to think about where we are now to where we started, in that early stages, project management was still a good thing, it was a common thing. There was still a need, a necessity for project management, right? Now the world has evolved. The landscape has changed, and there's a big emphasis now on product. And a lot of that's to do with, in my opinion, to do with Scrum. Scrum being a very popular, if not the most popular framework out there, and the emphasis on product ownership, right? So in that space, what we see now is a lot less about a project manager. And there's some backlash around in the Agile community around management or managers in general, right? And I think if we can park the term management and think of it as project leaders in some way, or we think ourselves as what a good project managers or managers in general that also are able to lead. I mean, we can manage resources, cool. Just about anyone could do that. But if we combine that with effective leadership, we have something powerful going on. So when we think about the roles, the different roles in the Agile world, we tend to think about this from where we are now. And where we are now tends to be either Scrum centric with a little bit of Kanban thrown in and a little bit of SAFe in some organizations, which again, flowing back to the teams, is more about Scrum and Kanban and pulls other things together, but is able to connect the dots at that portfolio level, if you will. So if we go back to thinking this in terms of Scrum team is made up of three roles: the Scrum Master, the product owner, and the development team. Except not everyone does Scrum. Not all teams are cross-functional, and not all types of work fit this current structure. Meaning, because we have this the emphasis on Scrum, and note, I'm not disrespecting Scrum at all. Worked in Scrum environments, that it works, it's fine. I got no drama with it. Right? You have a Scrum Master, you have the product owner, the product owner being the pinnacle, and then you have everyone else, development team. So what happens to your BA? What happens to your tester? What happens to your project manager? Well, they tend to get subsumed into the development team if you're a BA and a tester. But what happens to the project manager? Well, Scrum Master takes care of the people aspect. What about the project manager? Well, the product owner takes care of all the external stuff, stakeholder expectation management, and in some cases, the financing and governance and so forth, which a project manager would do. So again, what happens to the project manager? Well, one of the key aspects of project management is around that effective delivery. And not everybody does Scrum. So not all teams are cross-functional in the way that they're designed and the way they're made up. So how do we fit within that? How do we work in an environment where perhaps it seems like our role as a project manager is not there? So let's explore this just a little bit further. It's really thinking about how things are structured, right? And around the structures of a team, we'll see this in a second, right? I like Conway's law. Conway's law. So organizations which design systems are constrained to produce designs which are copies of the communication structures of those organizations. Okay, what we're talking about is understanding the information flows. And again, good project managers tend to be the ones that are able to see the information flow. Kind of like Minority Report. Tom Cruise is doing this thing like this. He's moving things around. Well, being able to visualize the flow of information allows us to be able to deal with that. And what you see with that is the organizations are designed around that. Right. So you will see a lot of organizations. If you pay attention to the organization that you're in now, and just have a look, how does the information flow? Right? When we see the information flow, then we can see and understand where the constraints are. And again, we'll touch on this in a few moments. But the reason why I'm talking about this is how then as a project manager, if we are able to see that, where do we sit? Because different types of interactions enable different types of teams. So I'm currently working with a rather large bank here in Australia, and they're starting to think about their structure and the information flow, particularly at that tactical level or that semi-strategic tactical level. So they're thinking about how, as an organization, can we enable our teams to build? How can we create enabling teams that support the product teams, the stream teams or product teams? And what about the other types of teams that are needed for a particular purpose? So when you see that in the way it's designed, what it's starting to do is enable faster flow of information. But what if we're not in that space? What if, say, for example, I mean this really respectfully, we work in government, state, federal, local, or just national government? What if we work in government? Right. Now, in that particular instance, changing a structure can be quite difficult, right? Because there's a lot going on behind it. There are people things, there are HR things, et cetera, right? So it may not be that we're able to change the information or the structure of teams or the environment, but perhaps we can identify the constraints in the information flow and then as a project manager, unlock it. And that's one of the key skills that we have also. And that is the ability to see an impediment, to unlock the impediment, to enable things to flow faster. So alongside this is also understanding the different levels of structure and how we are designed. Right? So again, government tends to be a little bit on the left. I mean that super respectfully. So the fact that we live in now a very VUCA world, is volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous. So if that's the case, then as a project manager, how do we start to enable the flow of information to be a little bit more smoother than the way our structure is designed? So how do we navigate a bureaucratic structure or an org chart, if you will, designed to deal with complicated and predictable? How do we navigate through that And this, again, one of those key skills. Who are the people we need to talk to? Now, product owners can do the same. There's no doubt about that. But they tend to think and focus on value and outcome, right? We're thinking about delivery. So then, if that's the case, how do we unlock some of these things so we can be smooth in our delivery, combine that with product management, product owners, product management, to enable valuable outcome to be delivered smoothly? There is a space for that, right? So whether that's subsumed into the product owner role or you have a separate product project manager, that is able to orchestrate that complexity, that is a valuable skill set to have. What you're seeing, and you're probably already working these type of organizations, is a little bit more to the right. You start to have a network, right? A team of teams, if you will, that is aligned to a particular vision or an outcome, right? Which requires effective leadership and an effective strategy. And that leadership comes from not only how these teams are structured, right? But also from the delivery perspective, project managers, and from a product or value perspective, product owners. But leads us on to an interesting thing. When we talk about VUCA, when we talk about the uncertainty, particularly the volatility and the complexity, have a look at the world around us. It's everywhere in front of us. And one of the key aspects there that we can navigate quite comfortably as a project manager is complexity. So understanding those different levels of complexity. Cynefin on the left there is a framework that allows us to make sense of the world that we're in, right? A sense-making framework. Now, there's a lot to Cynefin. So this is not about Cynefin necessarily, but rather to point out as a sense-making framework, how do we understand the space which we're in, and then how do we navigate that space with appropriate practices? So for example, if you look at the complex in the top left-hand corner, that tends to be where Agile works itself well. So for those that are working in the Agile space, things like retrospectives and stand-ups and all the lightweight events, the lightweight tools that you would use in design to uncover a problem using discovery, the close and connected communication and feedback loops, they tend to work well in that space. And executive practices, executive meaning to be able to repurpose a practice for a particular use, right? So we're able to do this, or we're adapting to what we see in front of us and to be able to respond accordingly. If something is, say, a good practice in more of that complicated space, well, if you're living or working in a really decent size organization, having an org structure is a good practice to help us to be able to work in a complicated world. There are certain constraints around that, right? They will govern the space in which we work in. We have to do this because of X. Whereas in the complex space, there are some constraints there that we can use to help enable us to navigate through complexity, right? Now, a good example of all of this in terms of Cynefin and seeing these different aspects of it would be COVID. And if you think back to, say, March 2020 and how we as a world we've navigated through COVID to where we are right now. So dealing with a complex space requires a particular type of skill set. So to channel my inner Liam Neeson, particular set of skills, gather over a lifetime of service, right, makes you a formidable enemy or ally, depending on which side of the fence you wish to sit, right? So as a project manager, channel your inner Liam Neeson, right? But just don't get taken. Or if your children do get taken, at least you know how to find them, right? One of the key things with this is also understanding our constraints. And the constraints are important to us because we know this as project managers. We live in that scope, cost, schedule world. Those are constraints. But understanding those constraints have a connection. That connection is to quality, which is a little bit more internal. So all the practices, the processes, the policies that we implement to enable quality to happen, but quality is married to value, which is value to the customer, right? So this is where we might be working quite closely with, say, product owners or product management in some aspect to understand what the outcome is. So it's not a us versus them, but it is a we working together and to enable that to happen. Now, if our organization is not structured with that or in a way that the org chart is geared to have a project manager, you're still effective, or we're still effective because we have that understanding of delivery and how to navigate those constraints and how to get the best of our people. Because the value also is within the context of these constraints. So they all are interconnected together. So how do we align those constraints? Now, the key thing with constraints, you tie in complexity with understanding constraints. So if we are able to visualize the flow of information, we understand the flow of the work in our workplace, I can almost guarantee you can identify constraints or bottlenecks in your system. And generally, it's the system itself that is the issue. And so how do we navigate through that? It's very rarely people. So in that case, there might be an occasion where it is a particular person, but if you look deeper, it is most likely the system that is enabled that constraint to happen. So identifying these constraints and amplifying or exploiting that constraint to allow that constraint to not be a hindrance, but rather to be effective working for us. Right? So it allows us then to not use the constraint, which is that number 5 right at the bottom there, to just stop that. Oh, there's a bottleneck. Boom, we're dead. We're not working anymore. That's not what we do as project managers. Good project managers find a way around the constraint. Good product owners with good project management skills and experience find ways around the constraint. And this is often tied back to what I would, in my head, is here's the work and here is the work. So a lot of the good work that happens in organizations tends to happen underneath the formality of the work, the processes. There are processes and then there are processes. So if we really think about this project management thing, it's really about us understanding the differences between this, right? So traditionally, perhaps a little bit more centralized in terms of our control. I'm the project manager, therefore I should have control of all things in front of me. Right? Or we have the project manager that just seems to be running from here, there, to everywhere, making decisions about everything and completely overloaded. Right? Perhaps we don't understand or are able to deal with a constraint, and perhaps dealing with our customers or our stakeholders and not really communicating effectively, perhaps, or understanding the load on that. The project plans that are in place can be very detailed. I once worked on a project. I'm not going to mention names or anything like that, but we had a Gantt chart, and I swear this was printed off on one of those. And this is probably giving away my age a little bit, but anyone remember dot matrix printers? And you had the acoustic cover over the top of it, and you had a like this, and you hear those printers printing off their things, right, in the computer paper. Anyway, I swear, yeah, I'm seeing a lot of thumbs up. Yes, you know my pain. All right, especially when you're sitting right next to one of those. Just trust me. All right, I'm pretty sure I've got hearing loss, but it could have been nightclubs. Who knows? Anyway, moving on. I swear, in this project, we had when they printed off the Gantt chart, we must have had like 60 pages of this stuff just printed out, right? And seeing how everything is connected together. And I can tell you now, this particular project went belly up. It failed, and it failed miserably. I suspect part of it was we were so detailed in our planning that we weren't able to adapt effectively. Right. So when we think about our planning, how do we adapt or become adaptive, right, to the planning based on what we discover right now? So one of the things I talk to with product owners, product managers, but also the same is true for project managers, is the question I have in my head, and I keep this quite forefront. Based on what we know right now, based on the context which we work in, based on the understanding we have, is what we're doing good enough for now? So that's the question I'm asking. Is it good enough now, based on what we understand? Traditionally, perhaps we have some sort of annual centralized planning. Yeah, there's some big planning going on, work breakdown structures, etc., etc., etc. Working on those waterfall milestones. I think we've all seen those sort of plans. To a more adaptive approach, which is more about decentralized decision making. So again, if you think about this, how do we push the information down to the most appropriate level? Or how do we push the decision making down to where the information is at. And that tends to be at that team or squad level. So as a project manager across multiple teams, perhaps, we're making sure that it's staying aligned and sync from a delivery perspective. Our product owners are doing the same thing, but from an outcome and value perspective, and then we meet in the middle, right? So we think about this whole demand, we're talking about value and the flow of value. Information or planning that allows us to talk to the main aspects of the story. And I'm not talking about a user story. I'm talking about the story of what we're delivering, right? And then being able to get into that space where we're able to plan, estimate, prioritize, organize, and then report back on what we're delivering with data, right? So rather than thinking about this in terms of milestones, I quite like the idea of a somebody mentioned this phrase, and it connected with me, which is an inch stone. An inch stone instead of a milestone. And here's a milestone. We need to meet this milestone. Bang, right? What are the inch stones? Sprints, if you will, is an inch stone, or a release, or a quarter, an inch stone towards value, towards an outcome, delivering on that outcome. And I really like this phrasing, which pulled from the book Team of Teams. Centralized planning, decentralized execution. So for those, again, working in a decent sized organization where you might be working in quarterly rhythms, right? And that quarterly rhythm is your centralized planning. We are working with our product owners, perhaps, or working with our value team to enable us to understand what we're going to plan for in this quarter. Centralized planning. We have a clear understanding that provides that degree of clarity. The decentralized execution is enabling our teams to be able to execute based on the plan, which means that they need to be aligned. So enable our teams to be autonomous, right? Which is one of the key elements to motivation, autonomy, mastery, and purpose. In order for our teams to be autonomous, they need to be aligned to what we're trying to achieve, the outcome. And we connect the dots as project managers alongside product managers / product owners from strategic to tactical. So providing that alignment or that linkage to the strategic world enables our teams to deliver tactically. Because now what we have is a very autonomous team that's aligned. So alignment affords autonomy. Which means then, from a project management perspective, what are some of the things that we need to be aware of personally? Well, one of those things is around the understanding the difference between power and influence. Right? Power, the capacity to get others to act based on our positional authority. I am a project manager. Right? Therefore, you shall do what I say. Right? Project manager, power. We have the power. You are the project manager. How many times have we worked in an organization or a project where we've had that type of project manager? Because I'm assuming that all of those here aren't that person, right? The person that lords over us, if you will. How many times have we had that? Whereas what we're seeing now, that push towards a more psychologically safe, inclusive workplace, aka our teams or our squads, the ability for us as a project manager to influence effectively. Right? So if there's a degree of power without authority, or power with diluted authority, I like to call it, and I've worked for a project manager like that, and I seriously wanted to inflict some pain on said project manager. But since it's so long ago, I'm sure the statute of limitations has passed, if there's such a thing down under, for those that are down under. I'm sure that's gone, right? So anyway, that person was extending influence, right? Extending their power with a degree of authority, but probably overstepping their authority to get things done. And when I met up with this project manager many years later, I saw the same behavior, right? But what it tended to do was tended to galvanize people to react against that. So they resisted, right? So we see a resistance that because you're being coerced. That's essentially what's happening, right? And that's what that project felt like. And you can see it, all the people around them. While we're trying to do good work, we saw the coercion and there was a resistance, a pushback. And for those that are on this call, they're down under, aka Australia, New Zealand, etc., that doesn't work. It'll work for some extent, but it just doesn't work, right? Depending on your context, of course. But however, if we're able to work together, we have a degree of compliance working with that, but that influence, the ability to influence a direction. And this is where it's one of those key skills of good product owners, right? To be able to articulate the vision. Follow me. Here's the vision, the influence towards the vision. But the same thing for us as a project manager to be able to influence towards delivery and to be able to do that effectively. And that's really predicated on effective, genuine relationships. Persuasion, yes, that happens, but that happens because we have built good relationships. So one of those really key things is having the ability to create valuable, genuine, effective relationships, often leading to respect, as it says here, or in Aotearoa, New Zealand. The phrase perhaps, or the word, or the kupu that you would often hear, kupu, would be mana. Right? But mana means more than just respect. It's a word that doesn't cross over as easily into English, but it means influence, it means respect, it means authority, it does mean influence, it means all of those things and none of those things, according to my limited understanding of that particular word. But the reason why I'm saying that is, do we have that degree of understanding or influence? Do we have the standing in our particular community? Do we have mana? That's the question. So how do we then influence with our authority? One of the key skills that we have, and I often talk to product owners about this, but one of the key skills we have, and you have it already, is storytelling. How do we tell a compelling story of delivery? The story of value and outcome is happening from the product owner perspective. But for us, how do we tell that story of delivery? And it needs to be passionate in a way that is genuine to us, but passionate in the sense that it galvanizes people to, we need to deliver this. This is the best thing ever. How do we do that, right? So creating those relationships, listening, understanding the organization and the flow of information, the context around that, the understanding of the political landscape. Right? How do we navigate through that? And to some extent, letting go of the ego. Right? So that project manager I kind of referenced just a few moments ago, high degree of ego, right? High degree of ego, but really wasn't connected emotionally. The emotional quotient, if you will, the high EQ, wasn't there at all. And perhaps perhaps it was just symbolic of the time, symptomatic of the time that was the space. That was a little while ago. So building those relationships, collaboration, build trust, right? That's going to get that influence. Understanding the organization. So how does the organization work? And this, again, one of those key skills that good project managers have. They understand the organization. And who do I need to talk to? It's all about relationships. And then understanding the expertise in our space. The difference between this and, say, a product owner, we're focused on delivery to a large extent. Product owners focused on the outcome to a large extent, which means for us that it's all about having or understanding the mindset. Right? So how then do we move from these different mindsets? Now, there are multiple mindsets. You just Google it. Google mindsets, and you'll come up with 1,001 things around mindsets, right? But are we in the fixed mindset? And this is Carol Dweck. She's talking about fixed. And Carol Dweck, I think, is probably one of those authorities in the academic world around understanding mindset and some way she articulates that. Right. So she wrote a book called Mindset. I highly recommend it. But in this case, she's talking about the difference between a fixed and a growth mindset. So the fixed mindset is essentially what you see on screen. This is the way I've always done it, man. This is the way we're going to do it. Yeah, the Gantt chart has always worked for me, right? Or the work breakdown structure. I don't need to talk about value. Right? This is the way our operating model works. Let's not rock the boat. Fixed mindset. Opposed to a growth mindset. What do we learn from this? Can we be better at this? How do we challenge the status quo? Or, as I tend to share in class, when I was doing some work with Australian Army pre-COVID, I had one Australian Army sergeant in my class. There was a few Australian Army personnel there. But the Australian Army sergeant said to me, break the rules, don't break the law. Now, what he's referring to with that is tactically, how can we challenge the situation? This is how I've interpreted it. How do we challenge the status quo? How do we challenge the situation so that we can evolve tactically, right? Which means that we need to challenge the current thinking as long as we don't break the law. And that law is the context of our organization as well as the law, right? Whatever the law might mean, the things that we're regulated by, right? Whatever you just determine that to be. But generally, if you think about it in terms of our organization, the constructs of our organization, that's our guardrails. But tactically, how do I challenge that? And again, you'll find good project managers, if you think about this, think about your experiences as working in projects, being a project manager. How many times have you gone from point A to point B, but you've gone like to point D, to point F, to point H, to point W, to point Z before you get to B? No. A lot of the good work we tend to do is by step. Right? The other thing that I've added in here is around the benefit, right? The benefit mindset, which is again being open to this and being able to again be more transformative in the way we see and view the world, which extends further to our people. So Agile being a very people-oriented way of working. That's the way I like to describe it. So the thing about the mindsets allows us to then to be able to understand how do we become better? How do we then learn from our experiences? And then how do we recognize perhaps the blind spots that we may have created? This is the way I've always worked. This is the way I'm always going to work, right? And be able to change and adapt accordingly. Which means perhaps that we need to think about our language. Now, L. David Marquet, if you look at his work, and I'm sure that you've come across this, and this is around intent-based leadership. But one of the key things he talks about amongst really other powerful things in his book, Turn the Ship Around, is about language. And he talks about this in his other books as well. But what is the language that we show? What is the language that we express? Words are powerful. As opposed to being a boss and saying, tell me what to do. Right? What do you intend to do is more powerful than tell me what to do. I intend to do X. What do you intend to do? I intend to do this. Great, because we shifted the ownership of that particular work down to or to the worker, if you will, right? So moving and understanding the language or the through the what L. David McKay talks about as the ladder of leadership, right? So I highly recommend this in terms of understanding the way we phrase things, the way we use our language, because it really helps create that safe space. And for those that are really keen on understanding the safe space, think about this in terms of psychological safety. You hear this bandied about in our organizations quite a bit. Well, we need to create a psychologically safe space. Cool. What does that actually mean? And a lot of that is down to language. Part of it is down to inclusivity and diversity to some extent, but it's all predicated on our words. What do our words say? All right. So when we think about our language and how we interact with people, right? This is a longer term, medium, longer term thing. We're not just going to go, oh, okay, cool. I'm going to change my language overnight and then that's going to work. Well, it takes time for people to adapt because we're shifting or creating a paradigm shift from command and control to a more inclusive space that is collaborative, again, pushing that decision making down to where the information is at. That means that we need to be quite transparent. For those that want some sort of underpinning on this, have a look at Project Aristotle and the way Project Aristotle looked at the 5 elements of high performance teams. And the first thing that they looked at was psychological safety, or in fact, the number one high performance element, if you will, of high performing teams was psychological safety. All right, let's get a little bit more specific on this. I think this is a key thing with us. And I'm seeing this in a lot of organizations, right, where we come across. And that is really around how we think about this key part of what we call MVP, right? Now, I'm pretty sure we're familiar with this. If I go to you, what's MVP? You'll go, oh, MVP, minimum viable product. In some cases, minimum valuable product. And then you go MVP. All right, let's throw everything that we can into MVP because there's no more shiny stuff afterwards. Because there's no more funding, man. So what are we going to do? Right? How many times have we been in that situation? Think about the way we describe it. MVP, minimum viable product. What's the minimum thing that we can do to learn? Or a rat. How about we test the riskiest assumptions first? Riskiest assumptions testing, if you will, right? Which is essentially a type of MVP, but we're testing those assumptions, right? Which then in turn allows us to think about what's the hypothesis we're trying to test, which is very product centric, very design centric, right? But again, from this perspective, rather than thinking about MVP, which is a little bit loaded at the moment in terms of the actual label, think about other different ways. Break the rules, if you will. Let's not talk about MVP, perhaps. Let's talk about testing our assumptions. We do this as project managers already. One of the ways I like to describe what we do is Henrik Nieberg. And there's a link there. He talks about this in his blog post. And in that, he's talking about, rather than think about minimum viable product, what's the earliest testable product, the earliest usable product, the earliest lovable product? I quite like that wording, right? Rather than think about what's the minimum we can do, what's the earliest? Because quite often in our delivery space, we're thinking about time. When do we need to deliver X that's effective? When do we need to deliver X that's valuable? When to deliver the outcome? What does that look like for us, right? So the earliest testable product is actually quite powerful. What's the earliest testable product for us? What's the earliest usable product? And the earliest lovable product, which is, again, something that we can now push out into release, into production somewhere. So think about how we might structure our wording around this, which is a language thing, right? Rather than perhaps thinking just about, oh, MVP, why don't we break the rules? Why don't we describe this in a different way, perhaps? Or if you're already using the label MVP and it's working for you, fantastic. Good on you. It means that you've understood to your extent, in your context, what MVP looks like. Now, one last thing that I want to share, and for those who are on the call that perhaps have a military background, you'll look at this and think, okay, I've seen this before, SMEAC, or for those in New Zealand, SMEAC, I think is what you call it, is a nice framework to help with our tactical problem solving and planning, but we can also use it in a strategic situation as well. So if using the New Zealand context, and I'll use G to start with, ground. Ground. What's the ground on which we work in, right? The topology, if you will. Well, for us working in corporate organizations, the ground could be, are we talking about a digital product? Is it a tangible product? The ground. What are we working on? Right? What does that look like for us? The situation. What has happened? The background to our problem. And we can do this quite quickly. As a project or delivery manager working with product owners and delivery teams, perhaps, we can figure out what's the situation which we work in? What is happening? What is the mission we're trying to achieve? Now, this requires us to connect and influence, talking back to what we talked about earlier, with the appropriate people, the product owners, the stakeholders, project sponsors, if that's pertinent, or some sort of leadership. What's the mission that we're trying to achieve? Because the higher mission becomes our mission to some extent. How are we going to execute that? And for us, this is our bread and butter to some degree. But even in the agile context, right? In iterative context, where you're working, say, a sprint fashion, 2-week sprints, 3-week sprints, 1-week sprint, whatever, or an iterative approach, how are we going to execute the plan? When do certain things happen? Again, influencing, connecting, working closely together with our product people. The logistics, what do we need with this, right? Are there things that are impeding us in terms of our overall structure and in terms of our framework, the way we're going to deliver things? The constraints in the flow of information, the constraints in the system, how do we unlock that? And command and communications, if you want to, RACI. That's essentially what we're talking about. Who's doing what? How do we communicate with what? Who do we need to consult with? Who do we need to inform? It's essentially a type of RACI. Sometimes when we think about it in this context, unless we make it explicit, we might assume that people are doing X, right? Or in terms of our comms, the illusion that communication has happened can be quite high, right? So how many times have we been in that situation where somebody has gone to us, but I sent an email. Great. When did you send that email? 3 days ago. And 3 days ago, you had 1,000 emails in your inbox. Like, cool. I'll get to it eventually, right? So it's like, the illusion that communication has happened. How do we think about our comms? This hooks back to what we talked about a lot earlier, which is how do we tell a compelling story about delivery? This is the same sort of thing, right? So this is a nice framework. I like this framework, right? When I use this, it's about help me step through. What's our situation? What's the mission we're trying to achieve? How are we going to do this? What's the logistics I need to consider? Admin part. How am I going to communicate this? What's the race around this? So, in summary, what we've talked about here is this: where we've come from in terms of agility and our starting point, our reference point, if you will. We've talked about the structure and how we navigate through that structure and understanding complexity and being aware of complexity. I think complexity is something that is there. It can creep up on us. It could be quite easily something that we just don't understand or see, and that will have an impact on our delivery. And of course, the things that we might need to undertake as skills, additional skills, or emphasis on the skills that we have as project managers, which is around our influence, which is around our mindset to be able to deal with this new world in which we live in, agile. Right? How do we navigate through that? Being open to learning and understanding. Right? And of course, our language. How do we hook all this back to the language, which leads us on to how do we then communicate this MVP, RATS, earliest possible X, and using a framework like SMEAC, perhaps amongst others, that you might have as a tool to be able to understand the view or the meta of the delivery space in which we're working in. So, if you want to know a little bit more deeper about some of these things that we've talked about, there's my contact details on the left-hand side, or where you can find a little bit more about that. Also pointing out that Soft Ed, which Colin pointed out quite nicely as part of the skills development group, agile project management, delivery at scale, product ownership, and product management, they're all kind of intertwined. They work really nicely together. There's one that I think I've missed, which is dead center in that, which is probably more around that facilitation and coaching space, because we do cross over into that world as well as project managers. So that's the webinar. Really appreciate you being here. Thank you for your time on it. I'm going to hand back to Colin. Colin, over to you.
Thanks very much, Brian. Yeah, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A box and put them in there, and we'll see what we can do. I really like that, Brian. It's good to see the range of options there, and in particular the fact that we're going away from a hard and fast command and control type approach, like you're saying, I'm the project manager, you do what I say, and recognizing the fact that this is really a team sport, isn't it?
Indeed, very much a team sport. The shift towards working in teams. I think also, and I'm sorry, I forgot to point this out, Colin. I'll come back to you in a sec. But also, AI for the AI world now, all right, and how that we could leverage some of that in the project management world is also super important. That's one I forgot to drop in there as well. So very good. But hooking back to what you've just said, absolutely, you're seeing this now in organizations. The most effective organizations are the ones that are able to work in that team environment quite nicely.
Mm. Yeah, it's that plus what was that quote from McChrystal about centralized planning but decentralized execution?
Mm.
It's taking quite a bit of delegation into that as well, I guess, isn't it?
Indeed, it is, but it also requires a high degree of trust. Right? Trust that the team can do X, but also that we as project managers feel comfortable enough, man. It's like, I'm giving up my space to a team, people that can deliver stuff, but you know, if that requires trust on both ends. So yeah, you're absolutely right.
Mm. Must take a while to build that trust and not to be hovering over people's shoulders, just watching what they're doing, waiting for the mistake, right?
Oh, indeed. I had the fortune to have a conversation with um, a 30-year veteran of the SASR, and he's in the high performance space. He is now a psychologist. He has his own company with his wife and other educators and psychologists, and they work with organizations in terms of building high performance. And I asked him, how do you build high-performing teams? One of those elements which you talk about, Colin, is trust. He then went on to say it takes time to build. It's a multi-period time. It's not just something, oh, well, I'm going to trust you. Boom. Tomorrow is high-performing. Generally doesn't work that way. So, yeah, great point.
I guess there's an element of Ronald Reagan coming in there, right? Trust but verify. Maybe not.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's going to open up a door. I'm not going to step through that door, I think, Colin. But yes, you're right.
Yeah. Well, I think it's creating the right environment, isn't it? Where to start trusting, you've got to give people the opportunity, but make it very clear to them that if there's any questions or anything, you're there as the backup, as the backstop, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. Indeed. All right. And when you, I think that's absolutely spot on. But because of the skill sets that we have, it means that we're able to navigate some of that. That's the complexity part I was talking about, and understanding those constraints in different systems that we operate in. So we live in a this is going to sound really bad, but we live in a political world, right? In the organization, if you really think about it, how do we navigate through the politics, the egos? How do we? And even though if our organization is agile, we still deal with people, and people are the biggest variable that we deal with every day. I see a question pop up. Do you see any threat from AI to the way project managers work or the way to do things? Not so much a threat, probably more an opportunity. Now, sure, you can again. I think it's a valuable word the way you use threat, but AI could be used to leverage the way we do the work, perhaps more around the documentation, or if depending on what you mean by AI, if you're talking about using AI internally in your organizational context, then we should be able to uncover patterns quite nicely. If you're talking about in the wild, using AI in the wild, mindful that the information that we're going to get back that's been trolled through or sifted through across whatever data sources that your AI tool of choice has gone through, be mindful that there could be things in there that perhaps are not as pertinent or relevant or could be downright dangerous. So that potentially, I guess you could say, is a threat if we're relying solely on AI. So part of the thing is, from a project management perspective, is to take what we see, understand the patterns, and then go over it and see the patterns again. What are some of the things that are valuable, and what are some of the things I need to discard? If we rely solely on it to produce our planning or rely on it for our documentation or whatever else that we need to answer questions, we could be in a world of hurt. Or how they need to adapt to latest tech. Contextual. It's super contextual, right? Again, I use AI. I don't dismiss it. I think AI can be quite valuable in the right context. If I want to check something, I will go to, say, ChatGPT to, hey, what about, and depending on the prompt or the question I would ask, hey, what about X? Or how do I do X, right? And see when it comes back, and then I will go off and investigate this a little bit further because I'm not going to just accept at will. So one of those key skills as a project manager is the ability to critically think through and critique what we have. Does this actually make a lot of sense for us? Don't know. Yes, no. We'll see what happens.
You mentioned the Cynefin framework before. I think some of that's going to come into this in terms of with disruptors like AI, where it's going to be more a case of sensing our way through things. Try something and see how it works and adapt and respond accordingly.
Absolutely. And I suppose part of that would be like for yourself, Colin, being uh, respectfully a multi-decade developer with experience, a multi-decade experienced developer. Is that a nice way of saying you've been around the traps for a while?
We get the idea.
Yeah, okay, gotcha. All right. Anyway, so you'll be able to cut code quite nicely. You understand how the code is, right? Whereas somebody like myself wants like a little code snippet. I could go to ChatGPT, go, give me a code snippet for X, boom, 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 boom. But I may not know how that fits within the context of things or how that could be better utilized, or perhaps how that code snippet could actually be refined even further, refactored so that it is a lot more efficient, right? Whereas you would see it and be able to implement that. So that key part really then is leveraging that technique with our experience, sensing that and understanding that it is still complex and we still need to navigate it.
Yes, indeed. Okay, well, we've gone past our finish time now, so thank you very much, Brian. We really appreciated that, and I believe the video will be made available at some later point. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you, Colin, and thank you everyone for joining us. Ka kite anō.